The village lay nestled between the deep, whispering forests and the gentle curve of a river that had flowed for centuries, carrying with it the stories of the ancestors. The land, rich with the memories of those who had come before, hummed with an ancient rhythm, one that only those who truly listened could hear. The trees stood tall, their branches like arms outstretched in reverence to the heavens, guarding the secrets of the past, while the river's waters mirrored the changing seasons of life. The hills, majestic and proud, had witnessed the rise and fall of families, of kings and queens, and the endless cycle of birth and death that defined the circle of life. The heartbeat of the village pulsed in the daily gathering at the center, where the elders sat in a circle, their faces etched with wisdom and experience. Their voices carried authority, soft but firm, slow but certain. They spoke in proverbs, in riddles, their words heavy with meaning. "Wisdom is like a river," one elder once said. "It flows quietly, but it can carve through stone." And the people listened, for the elders were the stewards of tradition, the keepers of justice, and the ones who mediated disputes between families. Their authority stretched to every corner of the village, ensuring that the old ways endured, that peace remained, and that harmony was kept between the people and the land. But now, beneath their calm faces, there was an unseen tension. The younger generation, those who had not witnessed the old struggles or felt the weight of the past, whispered among themselves. They felt stifled, their voices silenced by the elders long held control. Some believed that change was needed, that the village could not thrive under the rule of tradition alone. But to question the elders was to invite ruin, and so they held their tongues, their hopes tangled in the respect they were taught to give. The village, once a sanctuary of peace, now vibrated with an undercurrent of unease. The people could feel it, the quiet before the storm. Amina, the silent flower, sat by the river that had been her childhood companion. Her gaze was steady, like the river itself, but her heart was heavy, burdened with memories of a past that had been both beautiful and cruel. Her beauty was undeniable, her face a soft reflection of the moon's pale glow. Yet it was not her beauty that made her special. It was her quiet strength, her ability to endure, to bear sorrow with grace. To most, she was a woman who needed no words, who spoke with her eyes and her actions. But those who truly knew her understood that her silence was a shield, a barrier between herself and a world that had long since betrayed her. She had once known love, or at least the possibility of it, when her father, a man revered for his wisdom, was the village's chief. He had ruled with fairness, ensuring that all in the village had enough to eat and a place to sleep. His words carried weight, but they also carried compassion. "A leader is one who lifts others," he had often said. "The strongest are those who serve the weakest." But his sudden death had shattered that world. His passing left a gaping hole in the heart of the village and in Amina's heart. No one could fill the space he had left, for his leadership was rooted in kindness and justice. And now, her uncle, her father's brother, sat at the head of the village, a man whose thirst for power was as deep as the river itself. Her uncle had been different from her father. Where her father had spoken softly, her uncle spoke with harsh commands. Where her father had understood the needs of the people, her uncle saw them only as tools to further his own ambitions. He ruled with fear, controlling the people with threats, manipulating the elders with bribes, and twisting the minds of the warriors who once respected the old ways. His power was built on lies, on deceit, and on the broken backs of those who dared to resist him. And Amina, who had once been a girl filled with dreams, was caught in his grasp. His rule suffocated her spirit, her dreams drowned in the shadows of his ambition. Her life under his reign was like a prison. Every step she took was weighed down by the expectation that she would serve his interests, that she would bend to his will. When he demanded that she marry Kofi, the feared warrior. It was not out of love or concern, but as a means to cement his control. Kofi, a man whose coldness was as chilling as the mountain winds, cared nothing for Amina. To him she was simply a tool, a piece in the grand game of power. Amina, however, had no say. Her uncle's word was law, and her silence was her only weapon. On the night of the wedding, Amina stood before the people like a prisoner being paraded for their entertainment. The villagers, once her friends, now turned their faces away in shame. They saw her not as the daughter of the great elder, but as a mere possession, a woman whose fate had been decided by a man with no honor. The weight of the eyes upon her felt like an unbearable burden, and the whispers behind her back stung like sharp stones. She was nothing more than a symbol of submission, her heart shattered by the very people she had once called family. In the quiet corners of her mind, Amina had dreamed of a different life. She had imagined a world where love was not bought or forced, where her voice could carry the weight of her own decisions. She had dreamed of a peaceful life, where the burdens of her family's legacy were not a curse, but a blessing. But those dreams were now shattered, like glass falling to the ground, each piece a reminder of the life she would never have. As she was led to her new life, her heart heavy with grief, Amina could not shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. The river, which had always comforted her, now seemed distant and foreign. The village, once a place of refuge, now felt like a cage. She had become a prisoner in her own story, her destiny written by the hands of those who cared only for power and control. But Amina, the silent flower, would soon learn that the silence she had long relied upon would no longer be enough to protect her. She would have to find her voice, and when she did, the village would tremble beneath the weight of her words. Amina sat alone in the darkened corner of the hut, the flickering shadows from the fire casting long, restless shapes on the walls. The silence of the night was overwhelming, pressing against her chest like the weight of the very earth itself. For years, silence had been her companion, her shield, her armor. She had learned early in life that silence could protect her, that, by remaining quiet, she could avoid the wrath of her uncle, avoid the sharp, cutting words that came from those who would see her crushed beneath their power. But tonight, in the quiet stillness, silence had become something else. The silence now felt like a prison, its walls closing in around her, each passing day tightening the chains that bound her. She could no longer ignore it, could no longer pretend that silence was enough. Her mind swirled with the memories of her father, his voice rich with wisdom, a voice that had once commanded respect and admiration. "A leader does not hide in the shadows," he had told her, his voice firm. "A leader stands in the light, and his people will follow him." But her father was gone, and in his place stood a man who ruled through fear, through manipulation, through force. Her uncle. And now, Amina's silence felt like betrayal, not only to her people, but to the very teachings her father had left behind. That night, as the village slept, Amina tossed and turned on her mat, her heart heavy with confusion and longing. She could feel her father's presence in the wind that whispered through the cracks in the walls, in the rustling leaves of the trees outside. His voice came to her, faint but clear, like a memory that refused to fade. "Courage, Amina," he seemed to say. "Justice is not always found in silence. Sometimes it must be fought for, with words and actions." The wind outside howled like a mourning spirit, and Amina closed her eyes, trying to make sense of it all. She had spent so many years buried in the silence, avoiding confrontation, avoiding the pain. But the whispers in her dreams, the echo of her father's words, told her she could no longer remain passive. The time to speak, to act, was fast approaching. Amina's thoughts were interrupted by the loud clanging of the village bell. It was dawn. The villagers began to stir, their lives following the same rhythm as always. The women gathered water from the river, the men worked the fields, and the children ran through the dirt roads with carefree laughter. But Amina's heart was heavy as she made her way to the communal fire. Her thoughts were not on the chores she had to do, but on the life she could no longer ignore, the life of oppression under her uncle's rule. Her uncle, once her father's closest brother, had risen to power through deceit and manipulation. Where her father had sought balance and fairness, her uncle had sought domination. He had promised to protect the village, to bring prosperity, but in truth, he had done nothing but bleed the people dry. The villagers, once united in their bonds of community, were now divided by fear. Some, like Kofi, had become loyal to him, while others whispered in corners, afraid to speak aloud for fear of retribution. Amina glanced across the clearing where Kofi stood, his towering figure casting a long shadow. He was a man of strength, of power, a warrior who had once promised to protect her. But now, she saw him for what he truly was, a puppet, a pawn in her uncle's game. Kofi had always been distant, always cold, but she had believed in him once. She had believed that, through him, she might find a way out of the cage her uncle had locked her in. But the truth was clear now. Kofi was just another face of oppression, a man who wore the mask of a hero, but was no different from those who had tormented her. His loyalty lay not with her, but with the man who had condemned her to this life. Amina's heart ached as she watched him, but her sorrow was replaced by a fierce anger. How had she been so blind? How had she not seen the lies woven into his words, the deceit behind his cold eyes? Kofi had never loved her, had never cared for her pain. She had been nothing more than a tool to him, just as she was to her uncle. "You are just like him," she whispered under her breath, her voice low and tremulous. Her uncle had sold her, had traded her like cattle to secure his own power. And now, her marriage to Kofi, once something she had hoped would bring peace, felt like another shackle to add to the heavy load of chains already bound to her heart. The days stretched out before her, a series of motions, endless chores, endless obligations, but all without meaning, without purpose. But then, a thought took root in her mind. No more silence. Her father's teachings began to surface, once again stirring within her a deep, ancient power. She had always known there was something more within her, something inherited from her ancestors, something that lay dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And that moment had arrived. The time for silence had passed. Later that night, as Amina lay awake, she heard it, the faint whisper of the ancestors. Their voices came to her as they had many times before, in dreams and in moments of stillness. "Amina, the path is clear, but the price is high. Will you rise to meet your fate, or will you remain a shadow of the woman you were meant to be?" Their voices were a mix of warmth and warning, of love and truth. Amina closed her eyes, her heart beating in time with the rhythm of the ancestors' voices. They spoke of justice, of courage, of the blood that had been spilled on this land. They spoke of the power that had been passed down through generations, the power that could right the wrongs, the power that was within her. Her father's face appeared before her, his smile gentle, but his eyes firm. "You are stronger than you know, Amina. The silence is your shield, but it is also your prison. Rise, daughter, and let your voice be heard." The words of the ancestors rang in her ears, and Amina felt a stirring deep within her soul. She had lived in silence for so long, but that silence had only served to feed the darkness. It was time to break free. She would not be a pawn anymore. She would not remain in the shadows. It was time to reclaim her legacy. Amina's journey was not one of hope alone, but of blood, of sacrifice, of reclaiming what had been taken from her. The whispers of her ancestors continued to guide her, each step drawing her closer to the woman she was meant to be, one who would not be silenced by fear, one who would rise against the tide of injustice. As the sun set on the village, Amina knew that the moment of reckoning was close. She would face her uncle, face Kofi, and face the choices she had made, and the village, this land that had watched so many rise and fall, would tremble before the strength of a woman who had finally found her voice. Amina stood at the edge of the clearing, her feet bare against the cold earth. The night was deep and still, save for the occasional rustling of the trees in the distance. Her heart raced with anticipation, yet her body felt calm, steady, as if the spirits had already taken her into their fold. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the moment when the silence would end and her power would awaken. The old woman's teachings echoed in her mind, each word a steady beat of the drum that had called her to this point. You are the heir of your ancestors, Amina. Their strength is within you, waiting to be freed. But remember, power is a fire. It can warm you, or it can burn everything in its path. She took a deep breath, grounding herself in the earth beneath her feet. The ritual had begun. The stars above seemed to dim as Amina raised her hands to the sky, her voice a soft chant in the air. She called upon the spirits of her ancestors, the ones who had walked this land long before her, whose blood flowed through her veins. Her voice trembled at first, but then grew stronger, more confident, like the wind gathering speed before a storm. The ground beneath her feet trembled, as if the very earth was awakening to her call. The wind shifted, howling through the trees, and the air thickened with a strange energy. The elements were moving, shifting in response to the power she was channeling. The village seemed to hold its breath, unaware of the forces at work, but Amina felt them, felt the spirits rising, felt their energy flooding through her, as though the land itself was responding to her demand for justice. A deep, rumbling growl echoed through the sky. Thunder cracked in the distance, shaking the air with its force. The trees around her began to bend, their leaves turning brown and curling, as though mourning the injustice that had taken root in this land. The once clear river, which had been a source of life for the village, began to darken, its waters swirling with a sickly hue. A deep sorrow seemed to hang in the air, as though nature itself wept for the corruption that had spread across the land. Amina's body was now aflame with the energy of the spirits. Her eyes burned with the light of the ancestors, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to rise with her power. She called upon the forces of nature, demanding that the hidden wrongs be revealed. Her voice grew louder, rising above the storm, as though she was commanding the very heavens themselves. And then the sickness came. At first, it was subtle. Her uncle's household, proud and powerful, began to show signs of illness. The men and women who had once walked with strength now staggered, their bodies weak and trembling. They fell into feverish delirium, their cries echoing through the halls of the house, pleading for help they could not understand. The sickness spread quickly, striking down the proud and powerful with no mercy. Her uncle, the man who had ruled with such cruelty, could do nothing to stop it. He called upon the village healer, the elders, but nothing could reverse the curse that had come with Amina's vengeance. His household, once untouchable, was now at the mercy of the very spirits. They had long ignored Kofi too was caught in the turmoil. He stood helplessly outside the gates of her uncle's home, watching as the sickness spread like wildfire. His face was drawn, his brow furrowed in confusion. The man who had once believed in the uncle's rule, who had once stood proud in his service, now felt the weight of his own guilt pressing against him. He had been complicit in this. He had been part of the machine that had crushed Amina's spirit, and now he was watching as the consequences of that betrayal unfolded before his eyes. What is happening? Kofi whispered to himself, his voice trembling with fear. He looked up at the sky, where the storm clouds seemed to churn and twist, as if the heavens themselves were in turmoil. He had no answers, no understanding of the power that Amina had awakened. All he knew was that the man he had once followed was crumbling beneath the weight of his own greed. In the village, whispers began to spread like wildfire. The people spoke in hushed tones, fearful of the power Amina had unleashed. Some were terrified, seeing her as a harbinger of destruction, a force that could not be contained. Others, however, saw the justice in her actions. They spoke of the suffering they had endured under the uncle's rule, the long years of hunger, of oppression, of fear. Some began to believe that Amina was the one they had been waiting for, a savior sent by the ancestors to cleanse them of the curse that had bound them for so long. But the elders were not so sure. They gathered in secret, their voices low, their faces etched with concern. "This is wrong," one elder whispered. "This is not the way of our people. The spirits do not seek destruction. They seek balance." Another elder, her voice trembling with age, spoke with a heavy heart. "But the balance has already been tipped. The uncle's cruelty has caused too much suffering. The ancestors will not sit idly by and watch their children perish." The village was torn, divided between the old ways and the new. The younger generation, who had suffered under the uncle's reign, began to rally behind Amina, seeing her as the one who could finally bring justice to their people. They spoke her name with reverence, calling her a queen, a warrior, a champion of the oppressed. But the older villagers, those who still clung to tradition, saw Amina's actions as a violation of the sacred laws that had governed their ancestors. They feared that her vengeance, no matter how justified, would bring ruin upon them all. Kofi wandered through the village, his heart heavy with the weight of his choices. He had once believed in the power of tradition, in the strength of his uncle's rule, but now he saw the cracks in that foundation. The uncle's cruelty had gone too far, and Kofi had been blind to the suffering it had caused. He stood at the edge of the village, staring out into the distance, where the storm still raged. His heart ached, torn between loyalty to his uncle and the truth that Amina's vengeance had revealed. He thought of the woman he had once known, the woman who had been silenced by fear, by tradition, and he thought of the woman she had become, strong, powerful, unyielding. A woman who had risen from the ashes of her pain and was now fighting for justice. But where did his loyalty lie? With the man who had protected him, who had given him power, or with the truth that Amina now embodied? As the storm howled around him, Kofi made his decision. He turned and walked towards the center of the village, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his choice would tear him apart. The village was no longer the same, and neither was he. The time for standing in the shadows had passed. The time for action was now. The tension in the village continued to mount as Amina's vengeance spread its wings. The once peaceful community now found itself caught in the throes of a battle for justice. Some would rise to her cause, others would fall in the wake of her power. And in the heart of it all stood Kofi, the man torn between loyalty and the truth. The storm would not end until the land had been cleansed, until justice had been served. The village was no longer the same. What had once been a place of life, of laughter and work, now lay quiet and broken. Amina stood at the edge of the clearing, her gaze fixed on the ruin that had once been the heart of her people's strength. Her uncle, the man who had ruled, with an iron fist, now lay defeated. His house had crumbled, his wealth scattered like dust on the wind. But what she had gained in victory, she now realized, had come at a far greater cost. The air was heavy with silence, a silence that spoke louder than any words. The village had lost more than just its tyrant. It had lost its balance, its heart, and its direction. The power that had once flowed so freely, feeding the hungry and protecting the weak, had turned into a poison that seeped into the soil. Amina felt the weight of it all pressed down on her. She had sought justice, but in her pursuit of vengeance, she had shattered the foundation of the village. Now, as the last echoes of the storm faded, the people were left with nothing but confusion and fear. They no longer had a leader, nor any sense of order. The village was divided. The factions had begun to form almost immediately. Some of the elders, wise and weathered, tried to restore some semblance of peace. They called for unity, reminding the villagers of their shared heritage and the strength of their community. But their voices were drowned in the noise of those who now sought power for themselves. The young, who had long suffered under the rule of Amina's uncle, saw this as an opportunity to rise up, to claim what they felt had been denied to them for too long. The old ways, they whispered, were no longer enough. They needed something new, something stronger. Yet the old men, the ones who had once guided the village with steady hands, now stood powerless. The traditions that had held the village together were being torn apart, piece by piece. And in the midst of this chaos stood Amina, her heart torn between the justice she had fought for and the ruin it had brought. Her mind flashed back to the day she had first called upon the spirits, the day when she had felt their power surge through her, when the wind had whispered her name and the earth had shaken beneath her feet. She had felt unstoppable, as though she had finally claimed her rightful place among her ancestors. But now, as she watched the people she had once cared for fall into disarray, the victory tasted bitter. She had set fire to the house of her uncle, but in doing so, she had burned the house of the village as well. The spirits, too, seemed to withdraw their presence. Where once they had been a comforting voice in her heart, now they were silent, leaving her feeling cold and alone. It was as if they were telling her that the price of vengeance was not just the destruction of her enemy, it was the destruction of everything she had once held dear. Amina's steps were heavy as she walked through the village. The once bustling market was empty, its stalls abandoned. The children, who had once played in the streets, now hid behind their mothers, their eyes wide with fear. The elders gathered in hushed conversation, casting furtive glances toward Amina as though she were some dangerous spirit who had come to claim their souls. Amina, the old woman who had taught her the ritual, whispered as Amina approached. "What have you done?" Amina turned to face her. The old woman's eyes were filled with sadness, not anger, sadness for the path Amina had chosen. "I sought justice," Amina replied, her voice hollow. "But I have brought ruin instead." The old woman nodded, her face grim. "You cannot seek justice by destroying all that is around you. You have freed the village from one tyrant, but in doing so, you have brought forth 1,000 more." Amina's heart ached. The old woman's words rang true. She had hoped that by bringing down her uncle, she would restore balance, but in reality, she had only created a void. The village needed leadership, yes, but it also needed peace. It needed healing. As the days passed, Amina grew more and more restless. Her soul was clouded by the realization that the vengeance she had craved had not brought the freedom she had hoped for. Instead, it had brought sorrow and loss. She had seen her uncle brought low, but in the process, she had watched the village crumble beneath her feet. The people, who had once been bound together by common purpose, were now scattered, lost in the chaos she had set in motion. But Amina's heart had not completely hardened. Despite the pain, despite the destruction, she realized that there was still hope. There was still a way to heal the wounds that had been inflicted. The time for destruction had passed. It was now the time for restoration. And so, Amina called the villagers together. In the center of the village, she stood before them, her heart full of sorrow, but also of resolve. The storm had passed, and the air was still again. She raised her hands, not in anger, but in a gesture of peace. "It is time to rebuild," she said, her voice steady but soft. "The time for vengeance has passed. What we need now is unity. We need to come together as one people, not divided by past wrongs, but united by a common future. The villagers murmured among themselves, unsure of what to make of Amina's words. The old men who had once spoken of tradition nodded, their faces wary but hopeful. The younger ones, who had suffered so much, listened in silence, unsure if this new call for unity could truly bring peace. Amina's eyes searched the crowd until they settled on Kofi. He stood near the edge, his face drawn and troubled. Amina knew what he was, the man who had once betrayed her, the man who had been part of the system that had caused so much harm. But as she looked at him now, she saw not just a traitor, but a man caught in the same web of suffering that had entangled her. He too was a victim of the cruelty that had ruled this land for so long. "Amina," Kofi said, his voice trembling, "I have wronged you. I was part of the evil that destroyed your family. But I see now. I see the truth. I am sorry. I have no excuse." Amina stepped forward, her heart heavy with the weight of her own pain. She had lost so much, but in this moment she saw the possibility of something more, of forgiveness, of healing. "Kofi," she said softly, "I forgive you. We are all part of the same struggle, the same pain. You were not the only one to suffer under the uncle's rule. We all were." Kofi's eyes filled with tears, and he fell to his knees before her. "I swear to you, Amina, I will make things right. I will help rebuild this village. I will stand by you, not as a soldier of vengeance, but as a servant of peace." Amina nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and sorrow. She had come to understand that forgiveness was the only way forward, and so together, they began to rebuild. The village, once fractured, slowly came together. They worked side by side, the old and the young, the strong and the weak, forging a new path. The scars of the past were deep, but they healed slowly as the people learned to forgive, not just Amina, but each other. In time, the village grew stronger, not because they had destroyed their enemies, but because they had chosen to heal the wounds that had been inflicted upon them all. Amina stood once again at the river's edge, gazing into the waters. The current was strong, but it flowed smoothly now, no longer choked with the debris of the past. As she watched the sun set, she realized that the wisdom of her ancestors had not been in the destruction of her enemies, but in the strength to forgive and the courage to lead with love. And in that moment, Amina understood what true leadership meant. It was not in the power of vengeance, but in the power of forgiveness. The village was healing. The future, though uncertain, was now filled with the promise of unity and peace. The story had come full circle, as all stories do.